It sat deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest town, tucked between hills and thick trees. The listing made it sound perfect. Isolated, quiet, no neighbors. Exactly what I needed after the last few months of stress. I wasn't running away from anything serious, just exhaustion, burnout, the kind of mental fatigue that makes you want to disappear for a while. This was my chance to do just that. The owner left the key under a rock by the porch, just like he said he would. I grabbed it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It was small, just a one-bedroom place with a kitchen and a sitting area, but that was enough for me. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, just a radio and a stack of old books on a dusty shelf. The air smelled like wood and old fabric. A fireplace sat against the far wall, unlit, and there was a single window above the sink that looked out into the trees. After I unpacked, I decided to walk around the property. It was mid-afternoon, the sun barely breaking through the canopy overhead. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, listening to the sound of birds and the occasional rustling in the brush. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing out here but me and nature. I turned back after about 20 minutes, not wanting to go too far on my first day. As I got closer to the cabin, I noticed something off. The front door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I stopped for a second, just listening. The wind was barely moving the trees. Everything was still, too still. I walked up to the porch slowly, peering inside. Nothing seemed out of place. My bag was still on the couch, my jacket draped over the back of a chair. But the door had been open. I knew I had shut it. Maybe I hadn't latched it all the way. That seemed like the most reasonable answer. It was an old cabin, after all. The door could have swung open if a breeze caught it just right. I pushed it closed, making sure this time that it clicked into place, and locked it for good measure. That night, I cooked a simple meal, canned soup heated over the gas stove. I sat at the small wooden table, eating in silence, occasionally glancing out the window. It was pitch black outside. No streetlights, no glow from distant houses. Just darkness and the sound of the woods. I liked it. It felt like the kind of solitude I had been craving. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. The mattress was old, the blankets smelled musty. I tossed and turned for a while, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. Probably an animal. I told myself it was just an animal. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It took me a moment to clear the sleep from my head. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. The sound was coming from outside, from the front porch. I stayed still, barely breathing. The tapping continued, light, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. I reached for my phone out of instinct, but there was no service out here. No way to call for help even if I wanted to. I glanced toward the window. It was too dark to see anything outside. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, slowly, I heard the porch creak. Just once, like someone shifting their weight. I sat up in bed, listening. The creaking didn't come again. Neither did the tapping. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Morning came slow. When the first light filtered through the window, I finally got up and checked the porch. Nothing was there. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been standing outside. I told myself it was a branch, a loose shutter, some small, stupid thing my half-asleep brain had twisted into something worse. But I kept the door locked the entire day, just in case. That afternoon, I went for another walk, sticking closer to the cabin this time. I checked the perimeter, looking for any signs that someone had been around. Nothing, just woods and dirt and fallen leaves. I tried to convince myself I had overreacted, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But that night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange. The chair in the sitting area had moved. Not by much, just a few inches, but I was sure it had been tucked in when I left it. I stared at it for a long time. I tried to come up with a reason for why it would have shifted on its own. The floor was uneven. Maybe, but no, that didn't make sense. Something had moved it. I barely slept that night. Every sound made my heart pound. I kept expecting to hear the tapping again, but it never came. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I had booked the cabin for a week, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to spend another night here. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag. As I grabbed my keys from the table, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak from the other side of the room. I turned slowly. The chair, the same one that had moved the night before. It was pulled out again. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and stepped outside. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I locked the cabin behind me and didn't look back. The drive back to town was long, but I didn't stop until I reached a gas station. I sat in my car for a while, trying to process everything. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, stressed, seeing things that weren't there. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Something had been in that cabin with me. I never told the owner why I left early. I just sent a message saying I had an emergency and needed to cut my trip short. He didn't ask questions. I haven't been back to the woods since. I rented the cabin because I needed a break from everything. Work was draining me. The city felt like a cage, and I hadn't been sleeping well. I found the listing online, small, secluded, nestled deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The photos showed a simple one-bedroom structure with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and a porch overlooking a lake. It was exactly what I needed. The drive up was long. The further I got from town, the narrower the roads became, twisting through dense trees. My cell service cut out about 15 miles from the cabin. I had downloaded the directions beforehand, but I still found myself double-checking the road signs, hoping I was on the right path. The last stretch of road was nothing but packed dirt, covered in tire ruts. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still damp, the scent of wet earth thick in the air. When I finally reached the cabin, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It looked just like the photos, maybe even better. The wood was darker, aged by time and weather, but it had character. The lake in the distance shimmered in the late afternoon light, calm and still. A wooden dock stretched out over the water, and beside it, an old rowboat rested on the shore, flipped upside down. It was perfect. I unloaded my things quickly. Just a duffel bag with clothes, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife I brought more for peace of mind than anything else. There was no electricity, but the cabin had a gas stove and a wood-burning fireplace. The silence was heavy, but I liked it. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the trees shifting in the breeze and the occasional chirp of birds. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read by lantern light, and fell asleep easily. I woke once to the sound of something moving outside. Probably just a deer. I told myself. I wasn't worried. The next day I explored. There was an old trail behind the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude. The forest felt untouched, wild. At one point, I found what looked like an abandoned campsite. Just a ring of stones from an old fire pit, some rusted cans scattered nearby. It had been there a long time. That night, things felt different. I was lying in bed, just about to drift off, when I heard it. Footsteps, not heavy, not loud, but distinct, moving slowly around the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear, but something about the sound was off, too steady, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped at the front porch. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then the soft creak of a floorboard. The porch. Something was standing on the porch. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. The door was locked, but the thought of someone standing just outside, listening, watching, made my skin crawl. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps, no sound at all. Just silence. I barely slept. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt. Nothing. But when I turned to go back inside, I noticed something. The wooden rocking chair, the one I hadn't touched since arriving, was slightly angled, as if someone had been sitting there watching the door. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had shifted in the wind. Maybe I had moved it without realizing. But the unease stayed with me. That day, I hiked again, going farther this time. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick. I tried to enjoy it, but my mind kept drifting back to the footsteps. The chair. On my way back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree, not far from the cabin, had deep scratches carved into the bark. Long, jagged marks, too deep to be from an animal. They looked fresh. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I locked the door, made sure my knife was within reach, and lay in bed, waiting. The footsteps came again. Same as before, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My pulse hammered. I sat up, gripping the knife so tightly my hand shook. And then, a knock, soft, almost polite, 3 times. I stopped breathing, my body locked up, every nerve screaming. Another knock, 3 times. A pause. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, just enough to test it. Couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I sat awake until dawn, knife in hand. The moment there was enough light, I opened the door. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there, but the rocking chair was swaying slightly, as if someone had just stood up. That was it. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone. I don't know why I agreed to come out here. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. Work, the noise of the city, the constant weight of responsibility. Or maybe it was the cheap price. The ad had been straightforward. Secluded cabin for rent. No neighbors, no distractions. Perfect for a quiet getaway. $250 for the week. It seemed too good to pass up. The owner, a man named Carl, handed me the keys in a gas station parking lot about 20 miles from the cabin. He gave me a nod, told me there was no cell service and to make sure I locked up at night. Then he left. I figured he was just a gruff old-timer who didn't feel like making small talk. Fine by me. The drive up was rough. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt, and finally into something barely recognizable as a road. It was just tire tracks through dense trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, the wood dark and weathered. The front porch sagged slightly, and there was a smell of damp earth in the air. It wasn't much, but it would do. Inside, it was basic. A small kitchen with an old fridge and stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it had been there for decades, and a bedroom with a single bed. The bathroom was tiny, with a shower that barely looked functional. But it was clean enough, and the windows gave a good view of the thick woods that surrounded the place. It was isolated, completely. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. I hadn't felt that in a long time. No cars, no sirens, no people yelling into their phones. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. The moon was barely visible through the branches. The air was cool. I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something felt off. The cabin was silent, but it was a different kind of silence, one that felt heavy. I listened. Nothing. Just my own breathing. Maybe I was being paranoid. I turned over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. Too big, too wide. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and stopped at the porch. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. Maybe Carl had come by to check on the place. But why not knock? Why just stand outside? I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I kept the fire burning in the wood stove, just for the comfort of the light. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan and shift. Then I heard it, a soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, not an animal. It started near the front door, then moved along the wall, stopping at the window. I sat completely still, barely breathing. The sound moved again around to the back of the cabin. I stood up slowly, gripping the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fire poker. I stepped as lightly as I could toward the back window. The curtain was drawn. I debated pulling it back, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Then the door handle rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't a violent shake, but a slow, testing movement, like someone was seeing if it would open. I held my breath. The chair against the door shifted slightly, but held. Then, nothing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move, didn't dare to. The fire crackled. The wind outside howled. My hands were slick with sweat, gripping the fire poker. Eventually, I forced myself to check outside. I pressed my face to the glass of the front window, just enough to see the porch. Nothing, no movement, but in the dirt, I could just make out fresh tracks leading away from the cabin, back into the woods. I barely slept that night. I sat on the couch, fire poker in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't care that I had paid for a full week. I threw my stuff into my bag and practically ran to my truck. The sun was just coming up, burning off the night's chill. I started the engine, heart hammering, and backed up fast, sending up a cloud of dust. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was already fading into the trees. I let out a breath. Then I saw it. Further back, in the woods, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove, faster than I should have, all the way back to town. I didn't bother calling Carl. I just left the keys at the gas station where I'd met him and got the hell out of there. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I won't ever go back. And I'll never rent a secluded cabin again. I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle being alone. I liked my space, my quiet time, the peace of nature. So when my uncle offered me his old hunting cabin for a weekend, I took it without thinking twice. He hadn't used it in years, but he assured me it was still in decent shape. Just needed a little cleaning up. I figured a couple of days out there would be a good way to clear my head. No phone, no work, no distractions, just me, the woods, and a few good books. The drive took longer than I expected. The cabin was deep in the woods, off a winding dirt road that seemed barely used. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid the potholes and low-hanging branches scraping against the truck. It was late afternoon by the time I pulled up to the place. It wasn't much to look at. A small, single-story structure with a sagging porch and a roof that had definitely seen better days. The trees crowded in close, making the area feel almost claustrophobic. The only clearing was the small patch of dirt where I parked. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and pine. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out was how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I shook it off, chalking it up to the time of day. Maybe the animals had settled in for the evening. Inside, the cabin was musty, but everything was still intact. The furniture was covered in sheets, dust thick in the air. There was an old wood stove in the corner, a table with mismatched chairs, and a single cot pushed against the far wall. Basic, but it would do. I spent the next couple of hours sweeping out the dust, opening the windows to let in some fresh air, and stacking the wood my uncle had left by the stove. By the time I was done, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the floor. I lit the lantern I'd brought, made a quick dinner of canned soup, and settled in with my book. It was peaceful. That peace didn't last long. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, not exactly. More like an absence of sound. The quiet from earlier had deepened, pressing in on me. I listened, straining to hear anything. Wind in the trees, a distant animal call, even just the creak of the cabin settling. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it around. Everything was as I had left it. The door was still locked. The windows were closed. No sign that anyone or anything had been inside. I tried to go back to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, heart pounding. It was like my body knew something I didn't. The next day, I shook it off as nerves. I went for a walk in the woods, trying to clear my head. The trees felt too close together, the shadows too deep. The farther I went, the more I had the uneasy sense that I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, but then I found the footprints. They were fresh, not mine, not boot prints, bare feet. They led in a wandering path through the underbrush, disappearing and reappearing in the soft dirt. No signs of clothes, no sign of where they had come from or where they were going. Just bare feet, too large to be a child's, too erratic to be from someone just passing through. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, feeling a cold dread creep up my spine. I followed them for a few yards before stopping myself. What was I doing? I didn't want to find whoever or whatever had left them. I turned back toward the cabin, moving faster than I'd meant to. The silence followed me all the way back. I locked the door as soon as I stepped inside, suddenly grateful for the flimsy walls between me and the woods. That night was worse. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching. Then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound on the porch. Slow, uneven. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. The shuffling moved toward the door, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence that followed. Then, a soft knock, not loud, just a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced. If it was an animal, it wouldn't knock. If it was a person, why weren't they saying anything? The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn crept through the window. Then, finally, I dared to move. I gripped the handle of the door, my hands shaking, and yanked it open. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. I packed up within the hour. I didn't even eat. Just grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could. I told my uncle I wasn't interested in using the cabin again. He just nodded like he understood. He didn't ask me why, and I didn't offer an explanation. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. It was late October when my brother, Mark, invited me to spend a weekend at a remote hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. He had been there a few times before, said it was a peaceful getaway from the noise of city life. I wasn't interested in hunting, but he insisted the place had a certain charm, something about the quiet and isolation that reset the mind. I agreed, mostly because I hadn't seen Mark much in the last year, and I figured it'd be good to spend some time together. He promised it would just be the two of us. No distractions, no work calls, just good food and relaxation. That sounded nice, at least in theory. The drive took nearly 6 hours. Mark drove while I watched the thickening trees swallow the road. The paved highway turned into gravel, then dirt, and eventually it was barely a path at all. I didn't see a single house, car, or person for miles. Just trees. A whole world of them pressing in on all sides. "This is it," Mark said, pulling up to a clearing where the cabin stood. It wasn't much to look at. A small, one-story structure made of old, dark wood, with a slanted tin roof. A porch wrapped around the front, its wooden planks warped from years of exposure. The windows were dark, staring at us like empty eyes. Inside, it was simple. A main room with a couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, a small table, and 2 doors leading to separate bedrooms. It smelled like dust and old wood, with a hint of dampness. The only modern touch was a battery-powered lantern on the table. No electricity, no running water, Mark reminded me, setting down the bags. You good with that? Yeah, I said, though I already missed my phone and a hot shower. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire outside, talked about our lives, drank a little whiskey. Mark fell asleep early, and I stayed up, listening to the fire crackle and the distant hoot of an owl. Then came the second night. Mark had gone to bed early again, exhausted from a long day of hiking. I wasn't tired yet, so I sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, enjoying the quiet. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp when you breathe it in. The trees were nothing but silhouettes against the dark sky. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. And then, a sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. The sound of footsteps crunching in the leaves somewhere beyond the tree line. I held my breath, listened. The steps weren't close, but they were steady, moving slowly, like someone creeping, trying to be quiet but failing just enough for me to hear them. I told myself it was nothing. A deer maybe, a raccoon. But the sound didn't go away. It moved, pausing now and then, starting again. Then it stopped altogether. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I went inside, locked the door, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I told Mark about it. He shrugged it off. Probably an animal, he said. They sound bigger than they are at night. Maybe he was right. I wanted to believe he was right. That day, we went deeper into the woods. Mark showed me a small lake a few miles from the cabin. The water was still dark, almost black. We sat there for a while, skipping rocks, not saying much. Something felt off, though, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it, but that feeling clung to me all day. That night, I stayed inside after dark. Mark fell asleep early again, but I kept the lantern on, reading an old paperback I found on the shelf. Every little noise outside made my skin crawl. Then it happened again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer. Not deep in the woods, but near the clearing. I could hear the leaves shifting, twigs snapping under weight. Slow, careful. I turned off the lantern and moved to the window. The darkness outside was thick, almost solid, but I swore I saw movement near the trees. A shape, person. I held my breath, then silence. For hours I stayed there listening, waiting. Nothing happened. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Footprints, human footprints. They circled the cabin. I shook Mark awake. He stumbled outside, rubbing his eyes, and when he saw them, his face went pale. We weren't alone. We packed up fast. Didn't even eat breakfast. We threw our gear in the truck, and Mark started the engine while I kept watch. The trees seemed closer than before, like they had crept forward in the night. As we pulled away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood there, empty and dark, but something about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for us to leave. And just before we turned onto the narrow dirt road, I saw it, a figure standing at the tree line watching us, not moving, just watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Mark's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. He had seen it too. We never went back. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened to me that weekend. I don't even know if I want to try, but I feel like if I don't write it down, it'll fester inside me, growing into something worse. So here it is. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, some time away from work, and a cabin I rented online. It was cheap. Cheaper than I expected for something so deep in the woods. The owner assured me it was in good condition. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, but that was fine. I wanted quiet. I drove up on a Friday evening, the sun already starting to set. The road turned from pavement to dirt, winding through thick trees. It was beautiful in a lonely kind of way. The last 30 minutes were rough. No signs, no markers, just a trail cutting through the woods. I almost turned back, But then I saw it, a small wooden cabin tucked between the trees, just as the listing described. The key was under the doormat. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. There was a bed in the corner, a fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove. Basic but enough. I set my bags down and checked the place out. The bathroom was outside, a tiny outhouse a few yards from the cabin. Not ideal, but I could handle it for a couple of nights. That first night, everything was fine. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, then fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't until the second night that things started feeling off. I spent most of Saturday hiking. The trails were overgrown but manageable. I didn't see another person the entire day. No signs of campers, no distant sounds of cars. Just me, the trees, and the occasional rustling of animals. When I got back to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the door. It was open, just slightly. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. I told myself the wind must have pushed it open. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Still, I felt uneasy. I checked my bags, my food, the few things I had brought. Nothing was missing. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, small noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, probably animals, I told myself. Nothing to be scared of. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound just outside the cabin. A slow, deliberate shuffling, like someone walking around trying to be quiet. I held my breath, listening. There was a soft scraping against the wooden wall. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, listening. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours before finally falling back asleep, telling myself it had to be my imagination. The next morning, I found footprints outside. Not animal tracks, human footprints, barefoot, leading from the trees to the cabin, then back again. I tried to stay calm. Maybe someone had been passing through. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. Maybe they were just watching. I packed my things, ready to leave, but when I got to my car, the tires were slashed. All four of them. Deep cuts, like someone had taken a knife and made sure I wasn't going anywhere. Panic set in. I had no way to call for help. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away. I could walk, but the thought of being out in the open, knowing someone was out there, made my stomach turn. I forced myself to think. The cabin had a fireplace. I could start a fire, send up smoke, hope someone saw it. Or I could wait until daylight and make a run for it. That night, I barricaded the door with the wooden chair and my suitcase. I sat in the corner, holding the only weapon I had, a kitchen knife. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slow, close, then a knock. Soft, deliberate. 3 times. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I sat there all night, gripping the knife so tightly my hand went numb. When morning came, I forced myself outside. The footprints were there again, closer this time, circling the cabin. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my backpack, a bottle of water, and started walking. I walked for hours, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. My legs burned, my throat was dry, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I saw a road. A real road with pavement and everything. And then a car. I must have looked insane, waving my arms, half running toward them. The driver was a woman in her 50s. She rolled down the window, eyes wide with concern. I don't even remember what I told her. Something about my car breaking down, about needing help. I left out the part about the footprints, the knocking. She drove me to the nearest town. I called a tow truck, got a motel room for the night. The next morning, I went back with the tow truck driver. The cabin was empty, but the chair I had used to barricade the door, it was sitting neatly back at the table. The knife I had held all night, placed back in the kitchen drawer. And on the wall, carved into the wood, were 3 simple words. See you soon. I didn't want to go to the cabin, but I owed my brother. After everything he'd done for me growing up, bailing me out of trouble, loaning me money when I was barely scraping by, I couldn't say no when he asked me for a weekend away. Just the two of us. One last trip before he moved halfway across the country with his fiancée. I told myself it wouldn't be bad. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, sure, but I could handle 2 nights in the woods. I packed light, just some food, clothes, a flashlight. My brother, Ryan, was already up there waiting for me. He'd driven up that morning, said he wanted to get things set up before I arrived. He promised me the place was nice, a rental from some old friend of his. Secluded, quiet. The drive took longer than I thought. The last stretch was all dirt roads, the kind where one wrong turn could have you lost for hours. My GPS cut out miles before I even saw the place. No service, of course. I wasn't surprised. Trees closed in on both sides of the road, so thick they blocked out the sun. The deeper I went, the darker it got. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was smaller than I expected. Just 1 floor, a front porch, dark wooden walls. It looked old but sturdy. The truck was there, so I knew Ryan was inside. The whole place felt heavy, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but unnatural. No birds, no wind, just quiet. I knocked first, but there was no answer. The door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic: couch, table, chairs. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner. There was 1 bedroom and a small bathroom, nothing fancy. "Ryan," I called, but my voice felt too loud in the stillness. No answer. I checked the bedroom. The bed was unmade. His bag was on the floor, half-zipped, clothes spilling out. His phone was on the nightstand. That made me pause. Ryan never went anywhere without his phone. Something felt wrong. I stepped outside, looking around. The trees pressed in from all sides. There were no trails, no signs of where he might have gone. The only real open space was the lake just beyond the cabin. The water was still, black under the fading light. I walked toward it, calling his name again. The only sound was my own voice. The longer I stood there, the more I felt it. That pull in my gut, the one that said something wasn't right. I turned back to the cabin, hoping maybe he'd come back while I was outside. He hadn't. I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe he went for a hike. Maybe he just lost track of time. But as the sun dipped lower, unease settled deeper in my chest. I spent the next hour searching. I checked the woods, circling the cabin, calling his name until my throat was dry. Nothing. I tried his phone, no service. I tried mine, same thing. It was getting dark, and I knew I had to decide. I could wait, sit in the cabin and hope he walked through the door, or I could try to find help. The nearest town was at least an hour back, but driving at night on those roads didn't feel like a good option. I gave myself until morning. If he wasn't back by then, I'd leave. That night, I barely slept. Every noise had me sitting up, heart pounding. The wind had finally picked up, whispering through the trees like voices just out of reach. The floor creaked even when I wasn't moving. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but every time I looked, nothing was there. By morning, Ryan still hadn't come back. I packed my bag, grabbed his phone, and got in my car. The road stretched out ahead, endless trees on either side. I drove slow, eyes scanning for any sign of him. I didn't see him, but I did see something else. About a mile from the cabin, the trees thinned, and the road opened into a small clearing. That's where I saw the truck. Not mine, Ryan's. It was off to the side, half hidden in the brush, like someone had tried to make sure it wasn't visible from the road. The driver's side door was open. I stopped, got out. The forest felt different here, heavier. I approached the truck carefully, heart hammering. The inside was a mess. Mud on the floor, an empty water bottle on the seat. His keys were still in the ignition. That didn't make sense. Then I saw the blood. Not a lot, just a few drops on the steering wheel, another smear on the door. Panic surged through me. I turned, scanning the woods. Nothing but trees. No sounds. No movement. I needed to leave. Now, I got back in my car, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, and I floored it, tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. I didn't stop, not until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police. They asked questions, took my statement, sent out search teams. They never found him. His truck, his bag, his phone, all still missing. They searched the woods for days. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The police had theories. Maybe he got lost, wandered too far. Maybe an animal got him. Maybe he just left. None of it made sense. I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. Something happened in those woods. Something bad. And I'll never go back to that cabin again. I didn't want to go to the cabin. It wasn't that I had anything against the outdoors. I'd gone camping plenty of times, had spent nights under the stars, and had grown up fishing with my dad. But something about the idea of staying in a remote cabin deep in the woods didn't sit right with me. Felt too isolated, too cut off. My brother, Mark, had found the place online. A cheap rental tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. He said we needed a break from work, that we were getting too caught up in our routines. Maybe he was right. I hadn't done much in the way of adventure in the past few years, not since college. It had been the same cycle of work, eat, sleep, repeat. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. The drive up took longer than expected. The roads were winding, poorly paved, and in some stretches, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The deeper we went into the mountains, the more I felt like we were leaving civilization behind. The last gas station we saw was nearly 30 miles back. No cell service either. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt an immediate sense of unease. It was a small structure, old but sturdy, with dark wooden walls and a sagging porch. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even a century. The trees around it were thick, dense, almost suffocating. The air smelled damp, like the woods had swallowed the place whole. Mark, on the other hand, loved it. He threw his bag on the porch and stretched like he belonged there. "This is perfect," he said. "No noise, no distractions. Just us and nature." I forced a smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. Inside, the cabin was even smaller than it looked. A single room with a tiny kitchenette, a fireplace, and 2 narrow beds against opposite walls. The furniture was old, the kind that looked handmade. The wooden floor creaked with every step. There were no decorations, no personal touches, just a few dusty shelves and an old cabinet filled with mismatched plates and rusted utensils. Mark found a generator out back and got it running, but the lights flickered like they were struggling to stay on. I made a mental note not to rely on them. The fireplace would be our best bet for light and warmth. That first night, I barely slept. The cabin was too quiet. Every sound, every creak, every rustle of leaves outside felt magnified. At some point in the night, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Then nothing. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, Mark went to check out the surrounding area. I stayed behind, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I wandered around the cabin, looking at the way the wood had aged, at the scratches on the doorframe. Some of them were deep, like someone had dragged something sharp across the surface. That's when I noticed the hatch. It was in the floor, near the fireplace. A small, square door with a rusted handle. I knelt down and tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But another part, maybe the same part that had agreed to this trip, wanted to know what was inside. When Mark came back, I told him about it. He was immediately curious. "Maybe it's just storage," he said. "Old cabins like this always have weird little spaces." But I saw the way his face changed when he tried to lift it. The way his fingers lingered on the rusted handle. "We should get a crowbar," he muttered. We spent the rest of the day hiking, but I couldn't stop thinking about the hatch. Why was it locked? What was underneath? The more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they clawed at my mind. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. I heard them move along the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone was circling it. I sat up in bed, listening. The fireplace cast long shadows against the walls, and for a second, I swore I saw movement just beyond the window. Mark heard it too. He sat up, grabbed the flashlight, and pointed it outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. "We should leave," I whispered. Mark shook his head. "It's probably just some hunter passing through." I didn't argue, but I knew he was wrong. The next morning, we found the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, told Mark we had to go. He resisted at first, but when he saw the footprints, he changed his mind. We loaded up the car, but it wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Mark checked the battery. It was fine. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. We were stranded. We spent the next few hours trying to figure out a plan. The nearest town was too far to walk before dark, and with no cell service, we couldn't call for help. We'd have to wait until morning and hike out. That night, the footsteps came back. Louder, closer. Then came the scratching at the door. Slow at first, like someone testing the wood. Then more forceful, more desperate. Mark grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door. I held the kitchen knife, my hands slick with sweat. We didn't speak. We just waited. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The next morning, we found deep gouges in the wood. Whatever had been outside had tried to get in. We didn't wait around. We left everything behind and started walking. It took us nearly a full day to reach the main road. When we finally found someone to give us a ride, I felt like I could breathe again. We never went back for the car, never went back to the cabin. I don't know what was out there. Maybe some unhinged hermit living in the woods. Maybe something worse. But I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A secluded cabin deep in the woods. A chance to disconnect from everything and just breathe. No work emails, no phone calls, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the silence. I needed it. My mind had been a mess lately, and this felt like the perfect reset. The drive took longer than expected. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then finally to dirt. It felt like I was driving deeper into nothingness. My GPS had lost signal miles back, but I had printed directions just in case. The last turn led me down a winding path barely wide enough for my truck. Trees loomed on either side, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Finally, I saw it. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing, weathered but sturdy. It wasn't anything fancy. A single-story structure with a wraparound porch, its wood faded to a dull gray. There was a small shed off to the side, probably full of old tools or firewood. A rusted axe leaned against it. Beyond that, nothing but trees stretching as far as I could see. I parked and stepped out. The air was cold and still. No birds, no wind, just silence. Felt heavy, but I shook it off. This was what I wanted. Peace, solitude. Inside, the cabin was simple. A living room with a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a sagging bed, and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. The place smelled musty, like damp wood and dust. I dropped my bags, opened some windows, and started a fire to warm the place up. As the night came, so did the unease. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the air was pressing down on me. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I wasn't used to being this alone. I cooked a simple dinner and sat by the fire, listening to the logs crackle. I had no cell service, no internet, nothing but an old battery-powered radio I had brought. I turned it on, but all I got was static. I let it play anyway. It made the silence less suffocating. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A noise outside. Not the wind, not the trees, something else. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. I froze, my mind racing. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe, but the steps were too steady, too heavy. I turned off the radio and listened. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped to the window. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the tree line, watching. I locked the door and checked the windows twice before going to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin made my heart pound. Every gust of wind sounded like something moving outside. By morning, I felt ridiculous. It was just my imagination. I made coffee, stepped onto the porch and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the trees, the quiet, and my overactive mind. The second night was worse. I had been chopping firewood near the shed when I noticed something strange. Deep scratches on the back wall of the cabin. Not from an animal. Too precise, too deliberate. 3 long, parallel lines carved into the wood. My stomach tightened. I hadn't noticed them when I arrived. I should have. I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe they'd been there all along. Maybe I just hadn't looked closely. But that didn't explain the feeling creeping up my spine. The growing sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. Every time I started to drift off, some small sound would jolt me awake. The wind, a branch snapping, my own breathing. Then, around 3 a.m., the sound returned. Footsteps, closer this time, slower. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew someone was out there. I grabbed the hunting knife from my bag and moved to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. A breath, right on the other side. My entire body locked up. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Not frantic, not loud, just patient. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My grip tightened on the knife. Another knock, then another. A steady rhythm like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my throat was dry. I stepped back, knife shaking in my grip. The fire crackled behind me, casting shifting shadows. I waited, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then, after what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up, barely touching my coffee. I just wanted to get out, to be back on the road, to be anywhere but here. But when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. Footprints, leading from the trees to the porch. Bare footprints. No shoes, no socks, just the outline of human feet, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the cabin, stopping at the door. And beside them, something else. A single word, carved into the wood of the porch in deep, jagged letters. Stay. I didn't. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, tires kicking up dirt, hands gripping the wheel so hard they ached. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, until I saw another car, another person, something real. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know this. I will never go back. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The drive had been long, the roads twisting through dense trees, the sky turning a dull shade of gray. The rental company had warned me that the place was isolated, with no cell service and only a radio for communication. That was fine. I wanted the silence, the break from everything. The cabin was smaller than I expected, made of dark wood that looked almost black in the fading light. The windows were small, the porch sagging a little under my weight. It looked old but solid. The woods pressed in from every side, tall pines that blocked out the sky. Inside, the air was stale. Dust had settled on the wooden furniture, and a damp smell clung to the corners. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to open a few windows. The kitchen was tiny, with an old gas stove and a fridge that hummed loudly. The bedroom had a single bed with a heavy quilt, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. I spent the first hour unpacking and getting settled. I checked the cupboards, found some canned food left by previous guests, and made sure the water ran. The place was simple but functional. It was only when the sun fully set that I noticed how dark it got. No streetlights, no glow from distant houses, just a wall of blackness outside the windows. I turned on a few lamps, their yellow light barely pushing back the dark. The first night was uneventful. I heard noises outside, branches shifting in the wind, the occasional creak from the cabin settling. Normal things. The second day I went for a walk. There was a small lake nearby, and a narrow trail led down to it. The water was still, the surface smooth as glass. I saw no signs of other people, no boats, no footprints, nothing. Just me and the trees. That night, I started feeling uneasy. It was subtle at first, just an awareness that felt off. Like I wasn't alone, though I knew I was. The silence outside wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. Just silence. I locked the doors and checked the windows. They were all shut, the locks in place. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then the noises started. First, it was soft. A faint scratching at the back of the cabin, near the bedroom window. I ignored it. Maybe a tree branch. But then it moved, slow and steady, along the wall. Something scraping against the wood. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside. Nothing. The trees stood still, unmoving. The sound stopped. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. This time from the porch. A creak like weight shifting on old wood. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another creak. I turned off the lamp and waited. My heart pounded in my chest, loud in the silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking on the porch. I reached for my phone, knowing there was no service. I gripped it anyway. The footsteps stopped near the door. A pause. Then, a faint rattling, like someone testing the knob. I held my breath. The knob turned, just slightly. The door was locked, but that didn't comfort me. I waited, muscles tense. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found nothing outside. No footprints, no signs of anything. But I knew what I had heard. I decided to leave early. It wasn't worth the stress. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag. Before I left, I took one last look around the cabin, and then I saw it. The door frame. Near the handle, small but clear, were scratches. Deep, deliberate marks. Not from an animal. Not from the wind. Someone had tried to get in. I didn't stay to find out who. It was supposed to be a short trip. Just a drive up to the mountains, a few hours of hiking, and then back home before dark. But things never go the way you plan. The first mistake was not telling anyone exactly where I was going. I had mentioned to a couple of friends that I was heading to the mountains for a day trip, but I didn't give details. No one knew about the old cabin. No one knew that I had even found it. I had come across it by accident. Halfway through my hike, the sky had started turning an angry shade of gray, thick clouds rolling in over the treetops. It smelled like rain, heavy and metallic. I had no rain gear, no jacket, nothing but a half-full water bottle and a granola bar in my backpack. I wasn't worried at first. I'd hiked in light rain before. But when the wind picked up and the first drops started falling, I knew I had to find shelter fast. That's when I saw it. The cabin sat back in the trees, barely visible from the trail. If the weather had been clear, I might have walked right past it. But the rain had started to come down harder, and the sight of a structure, any structure, felt like a stroke of luck. The second mistake was going inside. The door was unlocked, slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping in. The inside smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by the wind that followed me in. The place was small, just one room with a fireplace, a table, and an old iron-framed bed in the corner. I should have turned around and left right then. But outside, the rain was coming down in sheets. The wind howled through the trees, making them groan and creak. I told myself I'd stay just until the worst of the storm passed. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, listening to the rain hammer the roof. The room was dim, the only light coming from the cracks in the wooden walls where the outside world peeked through. I tried not to think about how out of place the cabin felt. There were no roads leading to it, no signs of a path. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but something about it didn't feel abandoned. I tried to ignore that feeling. That was my third mistake. As the storm raged outside, I started noticing things I hadn't seen at first. The fireplace had ashes in it, fresh ones. The bed was dusty, but not as dusty as it should have been. There were footprints on the floor, leading to the door, the same door I had come through. At first, I thought they were mine, but then I looked closer. They were larger, and they didn't match my boots. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I hadn't seen any other hikers all day. This place was deep in the woods, far from the usual trails. If someone else had been here, they had been here recently, and that meant they might come back. I didn't want to be here when they did. I pushed myself up, ready to leave despite the storm. But just as I reached for the door, I saw something that made my breath catch. The footprints, they led inside, but none led out. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, scanning the dim room. The corners were thick with shadows, the rain and wind outside making it hard to hear anything else. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I took a step back, trying to think. If someone else was here, they had either been hiding when I walked in, or they had come in after me. Neither option was good. I took another step toward the door, and something moved in the darkness. A shape just barely visible in the farthest corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it shifted again, the faintest rustling of fabric breaking the silence. Someone was standing there, watching me. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person, tall and still. My body locked up. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then they took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I lunged for the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the outside wall. The rain hit me like ice, but I didn't care. I ran. I ran without looking back, branches whipping against my face, the mud sucking at my boots. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, even when my lungs burned and my legs ached. The rain blurred everything, but I kept going. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked to the bone, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out, tires slipping on the wet gravel. I drove until I was back on the highway, until the forest was nothing but a dark shape in my rearview mirror. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footprints, the ones that led inside, the ones that never left. And I wonder if that person is still there, waiting for the next unlucky hiker to find the cabin in the woods. I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods, but I had no choice. My brother, Keith, had planned this trip for months, and at the last minute he got sick. The cabin was already paid for, and I figured a quiet weekend might do me some good. So, on a chilly Friday afternoon, I packed up my truck and headed out to a remote cabin in northern Michigan. The drive took longer than I expected. The farther I got from town, the worse the roads became. Gravel turned to dirt, dirt turned to mud. Trees pressed in from both sides, blocking the sun, making everything feel darker than it should have been for that time of day. I kept my music low, listening more to the sound of the truck tires crunching over leaves and the occasional squirrel darting across the road. When I finally reached the cabin, the sky had already begun to darken. It was a simple structure, wooden, with a green metal roof and a small front porch. There was a fire pit out front, surrounded by a few old lawn chairs, and a shed stood off to the side. The trees formed a tight wall around the place, making it feel even more isolated. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and grabbed my bag. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and dust. It was bigger than I expected, with a small kitchen, a sitting area with a fireplace, and a hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was old but sturdy. A few deer antlers were mounted on the walls, along with some framed pictures of the forest in different seasons. I dropped my bag on the couch and walked over to the fireplace. A stack of firewood was piled neatly beside it, so I figured I'd get a fire going before it got too cold. I knelt down, arranging the logs and kindling, then grabbed the box of matches from the mantel. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were on the stone hearth, deep and uneven, as if someone had scraped at it with something sharp. I ran my fingers over them, frowning. Animal? Maybe a raccoon had gotten inside at some point. I shook it off and struck a match. Soon, the fire was crackling, filling the cabin with warmth. I sat back on the couch, watching the flames dance, letting the heat sink into my bones. Then, something thudded against the side of the cabin. I jerked upright, heart hammering. The sound was heavy, like a fist hitting the wood. I held my breath, waiting. A second later, another thud. This time, it was closer to the front door. I stood up slowly, listening. Wind? A tree branch? I moved toward the door and pressed my ear against it. Silence. Just the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. I turned away, shaking my head at myself. Alone in the woods for an hour and already jumping at shadows. I went back to the couch, forcing myself to relax. I pulled out my phone, but, unsurprisingly, I had no signal. I had expected that, but it still made me uneasy. I spent the next hour reading and trying to ignore the way the cabin creaked with every gust of wind. When I finally went to bed, I left the fire burning low, just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a gradual waking. 1 minute I was asleep, the next I was wide awake, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, and for a second, I wasn't sure what had startled me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not inside the cabin, but just outside the window. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the frost-covered ground. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom wall. I listened, my ears straining. There was nothing for a long time, and then scraping, right against the wood. Long, slow scrapes, like nails or a knife dragging across the cabin wall. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but the window was too fogged over for me to see outside. My chest tightened. Was it an animal? Person? I had no idea. I forced myself to move, creeping out of bed and toward the window. I reached out, my fingertips touching the cold glass. Then, bang. A hand slammed against the window, palm flat, fingers splayed. I jumped back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. The hand was there for only a second before it pulled away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight in one hand, the knife I kept in my pack in the other. I kept listening, waiting, but I heard nothing else. The first light, I packed up my things. I didn't care if I had planned to stay 2 more nights. I was leaving. When I stepped outside, the frost-covered ground was disturbed. Footprints, human. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin, and stopped at the window where the hand had appeared. I followed them, my breath visible in the cold air. They led back to the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. But near the edge of the woods, something else caught my eye. A small pile of animal bones, picked clean. And beside it, a knife, rusted and old, half buried in the dirt. I didn't stay to investigate. I got in my truck and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing: someone had been watching me, and they had come back to that cabin before. Maybe they were waiting for someone to come alone. I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I told myself that a dozen times as I drove through the narrow, twisting road that led deep into the forest. The cabin belonged to a guy I knew from work, Eric. He was moving out of state and had offered me the chance to stay there for a weekend before it sold. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, he'd said with a grin. Just you and nature. I wasn't interested in nature, but I was interested in clearing my head. I needed some time away from the noise of my apartment, from work, from everything. The road was rough. My old sedan struggled over the potholes, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog rolling in. The forest loomed on both sides, dark and endless. The deeper I went, the less I liked it, but I wasn't turning back. I had nowhere else to be. The cabin was small, old, and sat in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. It looked exactly like what you'd expect. Dark wood, a steep roof, a porch with an old rocking chair. I parked the car beside it and stepped out. The air was cold for late summer, damp with the smell of rain-soaked earth. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing, not a single bird, not a gust of wind, just silence. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and headed inside. The door was stiff, the lock rusted but functional. The inside was exactly what I expected. Wood everywhere, a fireplace, an old couch with a few questionable stains, a small kitchen in the corner, a door that led to what I assumed was the bedroom. Basic, functional. I set my bag on the couch and walked to the window. The trees pressed in close. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain why, but the feeling crawled up my spine. I shook it off. Just paranoia. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and my brain was looking for reasons to be uneasy. I busied myself, checking the cabinets, making sure everything was where it should be. The kitchen had a few cans of food left behind. The sink worked, though the water smelled metallic. The bedroom had a single bed, the mattress stiff but clean enough. The bathroom was small, the mirror above the sink slightly warped. Everything was fine. I kept telling myself that. I made a simple dinner, canned soup heated on the stove. Ate it at the small table by the window, watching the trees. The feeling of unease never left me. It sat in my stomach, heavy. It wasn't fear. Not yet. Just something. By the time I finished eating, the sun had almost set. The forest outside had turned black. I hadn't noticed how fast it happened. 1 second there was light, the next, nothing. I turned on the single lamp in the living room. The light barely reached the corners of the cabin. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, from outside. I froze, my body tensing. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A creak like wood shifting under weight. My heart pounded in my chest. I moved slowly to the window, peered outside. Nothing but darkness. I reached for the porch light switch and flicked it on. The bulb buzzed, flickered, then cast a weak yellow glow over the front porch. Nothing there. I waited. The silence stretched. Maybe I imagined it. I sat back down, but I couldn't focus. The uneasy feeling had grown into something worse. My skin prickled, my body on edge. I kept glancing at the window, at the door. Then it happened again. A sound, closer this time. A soft, deliberate creak of wood. Someone was out there. I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists. I wasn't armed, hadn't thought to bring anything for protection. Why would I? It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I stepped toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Listened. My own breathing was too loud, too fast. I forced myself to slow it down. Then, tap, light, just once, right against the door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I backed away, my mind racing. It wasn't an animal. No animal knocks. I reached for the kitchen drawer, yanked it open. A rusted old knife. Useless, but better than nothing. I gripped it tight. Then, another noise. Not a knock this time. A slow, deliberate sound, like fingers dragging across wood. It moved from the door to the side of the cabin. I turned off the lamp, stood in the darkness, breathing shallow. My eyes adjusted. The weak glow from the porch light barely reached the edges of the trees. I waited. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from standing so still. Nothing happened. The sound was gone. Maybe it was a tree branch. Maybe I was losing it. I forced myself to move, to breathe. I locked the door, checked the windows, then retreated to the bedroom. I pushed the dresser in front of the door. It felt ridiculous, but I didn't care. I lay in bed, gripping the knife, listening. The cabin groaned, settled. The wind picked up outside. Then, just as I started to drift off, a single, deliberate knock. Not at the door, at the bedroom window. I stopped breathing. My body went rigid. The window was right beside the bed. The curtains were thin. I didn't want to look. Slowly, shaking, I turned my head. A shadow stood outside, tall, motionless, not moving away. I gripped the knife so hard my fingers hurt. My brain screamed at me to do something, but all I could do was stare. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Minutes passed. I thought I might pass out from holding my breath. Then, stepped away, just like that, fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't move until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, there were footprints in the dirt. Large, bare feet, leading from the edge of the woods to my window. And beside them, a single rusted hunting knife stuck into the ground, blade first. I left everything behind, got in my car, and didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. I never asked Eric, who had stayed in the cabin before me, and I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. Either way, I should have said no. I should have stayed home. It was late October when I arrived at the cabin. The drive there was long, and the roads got worse the deeper I went into the woods. At some point, the pavement gave way to dirt and gravel, and I had to slow down to keep my car from bouncing all over the place. The trees grew thicker, their bare branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. The farther I drove, the less I saw of the sky. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a single-story structure with dark wooden walls and a tin roof. The front porch sagged, and the steps creaked when I walked up to the door. I had rented the place for the weekend, hoping for some time alone. No phone calls, no emails, no noise, just quiet. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The living room was small, with a couch, a coffee table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single window faced the front yard, but it was so caked with grime that barely any light got through. The kitchen was just as outdated. Yellowing cabinets, a scratched-up table, and a fridge that hummed loudly every few minutes. The bedroom had nothing but a bed and a rickety dresser. The mattress was stiff, and the blankets felt like they had been sitting there for years. The first night, I didn't sleep well. The silence was too heavy. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of distant animals. It was like the world had stopped outside the cabin. I kept waking up, my body tense for no reason. Every small sound, settling wood, the wind outside, put me on edge. The second day, I decided to take a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin, barely visible through the overgrown brush. I followed it, stepping over roots and fallen branches. The air was cold, and the sky was overcast. After a while, I came across an old hunting blind, just a wooden box with a slit cut out for a rifle barrel. It looked abandoned, the wood rotting, the nails rusted. Something about it unsettled me, so I turned back. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was slow, deliberate. I lay there, my heart pounding, listening. Could have been a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps on dead leaves. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, waiting for it to stop. Didn't. A soft knock came from the front door. It wasn't frantic, just a single light tap. I didn't move. My body was frozen in place. The knock came again, exactly the same. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had knocked a branch against the door. But I knew better. I waited. The silence stretched on. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no landline. I was completely cut off. I stayed there, gripping the sheets, listening. The rattling stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour before I got up. Moving slowly, I crept to the window. The glass was too dirty to see much, but I could make out a shape, something standing near the edge of the trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I backed away. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here this late? There were no other cabins nearby. No hiking trails, no campsites. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the figure was gone. I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for the whole weekend. I wanted out. As I threw my bag into the car, I looked around one last time. The woods seemed normal again. The daylight made it easy to pretend nothing had happened. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been too tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I started the car. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A single set of footprints, starting from the trees and leading straight to my front door. But there were no footprints leading away. I don't know why I agreed to come up here. The cabin was old, isolated, and far from any main roads. I had driven almost 3 hours deep into the woods, following a barely visible dirt path that twisted through thick, dark trees. I was alone. The idea was simple. A weekend to myself, away from work, noise, and everything else that made life feel too fast. I had found the listing online. A small, rustic cabin for rent, tucked deep into the forest, perfect for a quiet escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me, the trees, and the silence. It sounded peaceful. It sounded like exactly what I needed. But from the moment I pulled up to the cabin, something felt off. It was smaller than it had looked in the pictures. The wood was gray and cracked, and the front door looked like it had been forced open at some point and never fully repaired. There was a faint smell of mildew in the air. I parked my car a few feet away, leaving enough space in case I needed to leave quickly, something I had always done out of habit when going to unfamiliar places. As I stepped out, the ground felt soft, like it had rained recently, though the sky was clear and dry. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up to the porch. The steps creaked under my weight, groaning like they were about to snap. I hesitated for a second before unlocking the door and pushing it open. Inside, it was just as expected, simple and bare. A small kitchen with an old gas stove and a tiny fridge sat in the corner. A wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs. A couch that looked decades old. And against the back wall, a single bed with a thin mattress. There was one window in the main room and another by the bed. Both were dirty, streaked with dust and grime. There was no television, no radio, just silence. I set my bag down on the table and exhaled. The air inside smelled stale, like the place hadn't been used in a long time. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but this was almost too quiet. I reminded myself that's what I came here for. I checked the kitchen cabinets. A few old plates, a couple of pots, some mismatched utensils. No food. I had brought my own supplies, so that didn't bother me. I checked under the sink. A few cleaning supplies, a roll of paper towels. Nothing strange. The bathroom was tiny. A single toilet, a small sink, and a shower that looked barely functional. The pipes groaned when I turned the faucet, spitting out brownish water before clearing up. The mirror above the sink was cracked in the corner, and the door didn't have a lock. I went back to the main room, sat on the couch, and pulled out my book. I tried to read, but the silence was different than I expected. It wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy. The kind of silence that made you aware of every sound your body made. Your breath, the shifting of your clothes, the way your heartbeat sounded in your ears. I shook it off and decided to make some food. I set up my small camping stove outside on the porch and boiled water for instant noodles. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the trees. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettling. I felt watched, but that was just my mind playing tricks on me. After eating, I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. They had old, flimsy latches, easy to break if someone wanted to. But there was no one out here, just me. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The wooden beams above me were covered in cobwebs. I turned onto my side, facing the window. The trees outside barely moved in the wind. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. And then I heard it, a single, deliberate step on the porch. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe an animal. A raccoon, a fox. Something small. Then another step. Slow. Heavy. Not an animal. I didn't move. I listened. The wooden boards creaked under the weight of something or someone. My heart pounded. I stared at the front door, barely visible in the dim light. Then, nothing. No knock. No sound of retreating footsteps. Just silence. I reached for my phone before remembering there was no service. My car keys were on the table just a few feet away. I could grab them, run to my car, and leave. But I didn't move. I just waited. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 30. Finally, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I turned it on and pointed it at the door. No movement. I stood slowly, moving as quietly as possible, and walked toward the window. I lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the dirt path, my car. I exhaled, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the old wood of the porch had shifted on its own. Maybe I was too on edge. I turned off the flashlight, set it next to my bed, and lay back down. I didn't sleep much. By morning, the fear felt ridiculous. In the daylight, the cabin seemed less threatening. I made coffee on my camping stove and sat on the porch watching the trees. Everything was calm, but when I stepped off the porch to stretch my legs, I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep impressions in the dirt, leading from the trees to my porch. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or rain. I turned slowly, looking back toward the trees. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I grabbed my keys from inside, locked the door behind me, and got in my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to. The cabin was smaller than I expected, buried deep in the woods, barely visible from the dirt road that led up to it. The trees grew too close together, the thick canopy above casting heavy shadows even in the middle of the afternoon. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched for years, like it belonged to the forest more than to anyone who had built it. I had rented it for the weekend, just me alone to get some time away. My job had been grinding me down, and the idea of escaping into the quiet, away from emails and phone calls, seemed like the perfect reset. I found the place online. Cheap, secluded, and just close enough to civilization that I didn't think twice about it. The listing described it as a rustic getaway for those seeking solitude. That part was true, but the photos had done a good job hiding just how neglected it was. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I walked up to the door. The paint was peeling, and the doorknob was ice cold when I touched it, like it had been sitting in the shade for years. The key worked, but I had to push hard against the door to get it to open, the wood swollen from time and weather. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. The single-room cabin had a small kitchenette on one side, a fireplace against the far wall, and a bed pushed up against the window. There was no TV, no internet, and no cell service. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect completely. I dropped my bag on the bed and stood there for a minute, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The windows were small, and the trees outside blocked most of the light. It was dead silent, except for the occasional creak of wood settling. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read a book by flashlight when the single overhead bulb flickered and went out, and fell asleep listening to the wind outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep. The cabin was dark, the kind of dark that swallows everything. I sat up, rubbing my face, and listened. Nothing, just the wind, the distant rustling of leaves. I laid back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. Something felt off. The air in the cabin felt heavier, like the walls were closing in just a little. I told myself I was just unused to the isolation. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I imagined it. The second day, I decided to hike around. The forest was dense, the kind that felt untouched by people. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up through the dirt, making every step a careful one. I walked for hours, not following any real path, just moving. That's when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. About a mile from the cabin, I saw it. A clearing, empty except for the remains of a small fire pit and a few scattered objects. A rusted can, an old backpack, torn apart like something had clawed through it. And then there were the scratches, deep gouges in the trees like someone had taken a knife and hacked away at the bark. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, almost like a pattern. Not words, not symbols, just lines, jagged and angry. I turned back. As I made my way to the cabin, I felt it again, that heavy silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, I locked the door. I wedged a chair under the handle, even though it felt stupid. Just paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Sleep didn't come easy. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I heard it. A sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, heart pounding, listening. Something moved past the window, a shadow too quick to catch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, stretching out into eternity. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated. The cabin felt too small, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came like a relief, but the unease stayed. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. No signs that anyone had been there. No footprints in the dirt. Just my own paranoia, turning shadows into threats. But then I saw it. On the wooden railing of the porch, fresh scratches. Just like the ones on the trees. My stomach turned. I packed my bag. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was probably an animal. But I wasn't going to stay to find out. As I got in my car, I took one last look at the cabin. In the trees just beyond the clearing, something moved. A shape tall, still watching. I drove away without looking back. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from the stress of work, responsibilities, and people. I needed the break. Life had been grinding me down, and the idea of complete solitude seemed like the perfect remedy. I packed everything I would need: food, water, my hunting rifle, a first aid kit, and enough firewood to last the week. The cabin was old, but I had rented it from an older man who assured me it was sturdy, warm, and safe. The drive out took longer than expected. The roads became rough, winding through thick, endless forest. The farther I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no gas stations, not even road signs. Just trees and silence. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by dense woods, its wooden frame dark with age. The place had a certain weight to it. Something about the stillness around it made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling down, chalking it up to exhaustion from the long drive. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was basic. A table, 2 chairs, a single bed with a thick, musty blanket, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no electricity, only an old oil lamp and a few candles. The first thing I did was light a fire. The warmth and crackling sound made the place feel less empty. I made a simple meal, ate quickly, and decided to get some rest. That first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. Something had pulled me from my sleep, though I couldn't say what. I listened, but all I heard was the wind pushing through the trees. I turned over, convinced I was just adjusting to the silence, and forced myself back to sleep. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it outside, walking the woods, testing my rifle, and enjoying the quiet. By evening, I felt more comfortable. The tension from the night before had faded. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and read an old book I found on the shelf. It was peaceful. Then, around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Slow, careful footsteps moving around the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. I reached for my rifle, but my hands were shaking. I didn't turn on the lamp. I just sat there in the dark, listening. The steps moved closer. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. Whoever it was, they were just outside my window now. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in shadows. I saw nothing outside, but the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered close, and I had overreacted. I went back to bed, rifle within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I stepped outside, looking for tracks. There were none. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and I should have seen some disturbance, but it was untouched. That didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe the loneliness was getting to me. That night, it happened again. The footsteps, slow, careful. This time, they circled the cabin twice. I gripped my rifle tight, sitting in the dark. My breathing was too loud in my ears. I was too scared to look outside. Again, the steps stopped, and silence followed. I barely slept. The fourth day, I debated leaving. But I had paid for the week, and I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stuck close to the cabin, keeping my rifle with me at all times. As night fell, dread settled in my chest. The footsteps came earlier this time, just after sundown. They were heavier, slower. They circled the cabin 3 times. I sat in the corner, rifle in my lap, staring at the door. I thought about calling out, but what if someone answered? What if they tried to get in? I didn't move until morning. That day, I made a decision. I would leave at first light. But when I went outside to pack my truck, I stopped cold. There were footprints, human footprints. They led from the woods, circled the cabin, then stopped at my bedroom window. Whoever had been out there had stood by my window for hours, watching. I packed faster than I ever had in my life. The drive back felt endless, but I didn't stop. Not until I was home. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and careful, and I don't look. I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head, away from the constant hum of the city. When I found an old cabin listing online, deep in the Appalachian woods, it seemed perfect. The pictures showed a sturdy, one-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchenette, and a loft for sleeping. The owner rented it out cheap, warning that it was far from town with no cell service or electricity, just a generator for emergencies. That didn't bother me. In fact, it sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive was long, winding up narrow mountain roads that barely had enough room for my truck. The deeper I went, the denser the trees became, pressing in from both sides. The sunlight dimmed as the canopy grew thicker, the silence heavier than I expected. No cars passed me, no houses dotted the roadside, just endless, towering trees. The GPS signal died about an hour before I reached the turnoff, leaving me with only the printed directions I had brought. When I finally found the unmarked gravel path leading to the cabin, I almost missed it. The drive up was rough, the path barely more than ruts through the forest. My truck bounced over rocks and dips, the trees scraping along the sides like fingers dragging over metal. I had the window cracked, but the air smelled damp and earthy, with the faintest trace of something rotten. Probably just a dead animal nearby, I told myself. When the cabin came into view, my first thought was relief. It looked exactly like the pictures, small but solid, made of thick logs with a steeply pitched roof. A covered porch wrapped around the front, with a single wooden rocking chair swaying slightly in the breeze. But as I cut the engine, a strange feeling settled in my chest. The silence wasn't normal. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the buzzing of insects, just absolute stillness. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my nerves. I'd been alone in the woods before, though never this deep. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed inside, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The inside smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly musty, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in a while. The furniture was simple: an old couch, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace against the far wall. A ladder led up to the loft, where a single mattress lay on the floor under a slanted roof. The only window up there was small, barely enough to let in the fading daylight. I spent the first hour unpacking, getting used to the space. I checked the generator, found it in working order, and lit a few oil lamps. By the time I sat down to eat, the sky had turned a deep blue, shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch outside, like a footstep on gravel. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. Came again, closer this time. I moved to the window slowly, careful not to make a sound, and peered out. Nothing, just the empty clearing, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Probably a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon, something harmless. Still, I locked the door before heading up to the loft. I barely slept that first night, waking up to every creak, every gust of wind against the cabin walls. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the tiny window, the forest alive with sound. The birds had returned, the trees rustled with small creatures. Felt normal again. Maybe I had just been on edge from the isolation. The second day passed without issue. I hiked a few miles from the cabin, following a narrow deer trail through the woods. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it felt. The trees seemed too close together, their branches reaching toward each other like skeletal fingers. The air smelled off, damp and metallic, like wet pennies. I found an old fire pit, long abandoned, half buried under fallen leaves. Nearby, there was a crude wooden structure, almost like a hunting blind but built low to the ground. Its slanted roof caved in. It didn't look like it had been used in years. That night, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, deep, slow, just outside the walls of the cabin. I lay frozen in the loft, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound moved, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, but then I heard something that made my skin go ice cold. A low scraping sound, like fingernails dragging along the wood. I reached for my flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. I flicked it on, shining it toward the window. The light bounced off the glass, showing only my own pale face, wide-eyed and terrified. The scraping stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was done. I didn't care if it was my imagination. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet again, the same unnatural silence as when I arrived. My truck sat where I left it, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. The inside was torn apart. Glove box open, my papers scattered, the seat slashed as if by a knife. But the worst part was what was left on the dashboard. A single, muddy handprint. Human, too big to be mine. I didn't think. I just ran. I jumped into the truck, turned the key, and thanked God when the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as I reversed too fast, nearly fishtailing into the trees. As I sped down the path, something moved in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the highway, until I had service again, until I saw the familiar glow of a gas station sign and pulled over. I sat there for a long time, hands shaking, breath coming too fast. I checked my phone, found a dozen missed calls. But when I looked up the rental listing again, it was gone. No records, no reviews, no sign it had ever existed. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I will never go back. The drive up to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The trees seemed to close in tighter around the narrow road the higher I climbed, their twisted branches blocking out the already fading daylight. The map had shown this place as remote, but now, with no cell service and nothing but the crunch of my tires on the gravel to keep me company, the word remote felt like an understatement. I had booked this trip as a way to get some time alone. Work had been a nightmare lately, and everything in my life felt like it was slipping out of control. I figured a few days away from the city, just me, the quiet, and a bottle of whiskey, might be what I needed to reset. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, made of dark logs that had probably been standing for 50 years or more. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the front porch creaked under my weight when I stepped up to the door. The key was where the owner said it would be, in a rusted lockbox under the second step. I turned it in the lock, pushed the heavy door open, and immediately caught the scent of dust and old wood. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, and a single bedroom in the back. The windows were small, just enough to let in some light but not enough to give a good view of the outside. The air was cold, the kind of cold that settles into a place that hasn't been lived in for a while. I flipped on a few lights, dropped my bag in the bedroom, and went to check the fireplace. The owner had left a stack of wood beside it, just like he'd promised. After getting a fire going, I poured myself a drink and settled into one of the old armchairs in front of the hearth. The flames crackled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes. I told myself it was nothing, just the sounds of being alone in the woods. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but as I sat up, I heard it more clearly, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped just outside the cabin. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no service, no way to call for help. I moved to the window, careful to keep out of sight, and peered through the glass. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. I waited, listening for another sound, but the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. After a while, I convinced myself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon rummaging around. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my nerves tighten. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not animal tracks, human. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The prints circled the cabin, pausing at the windows and the front door. Someone had been here, walking the perimeter of the cabin while I was inside. Asleep. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I told myself it had to be a hiker who'd gotten lost, maybe a hunter passing through. But that didn't explain why they had stopped at the windows, why they had stood at my door. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I hiked a little, sticking close to the cabin. I chopped some wood, trying to keep my hands busy. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. That night, I locked the door and pushed one of the chairs in front of it, just in case. I kept the fire going, the glow making the shadows dance along the walls. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to the sound of the door handle rattling. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The fire had burned low, casting weak light across the room. The door handle twisted again, a slow, careful movement, like someone testing the lock. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The rattling stopped. Then a soft tap, tap, tap against the window. I turned my head slowly. Through the glass, I could just barely make out the shape of a figure standing there, motionless. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't dare move closer. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the figure turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the figure was gone, but the footprints remained, fresh in the damp earth. I packed my things in a hurry, tossing everything into my truck without bothering to fold or organize. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I caught one last look at the cabin in the rearview mirror. There, just at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I had service, then called the cabin owner. Told him someone had been out there. Told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." I hung up and kept driving. I didn't ask any more questions, and I sure as hell never went back. I told myself I needed the break. Work had been grinding me down, and the city felt like it was closing in. The idea of spending a week in a remote cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees, seemed perfect. No distractions, no people, just quiet. I found the place online, a one-bedroom cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. The owner, a guy named Dave, had warned me about spotty cell service and the nearest town being 30 miles away, but that was what I wanted. Isolation. I packed enough food and supplies for a week and drove out early on a Saturday morning. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch was just a dirt road cutting through miles of thick forest. My GPS cut out halfway there, and I had to rely on the printed directions Dave had emailed me. I nearly missed the turn onto the cabin's driveway, a narrow path barely visible through the trees. My car rocked and groaned over the uneven ground, but eventually, the cabin appeared through the trees, sitting in a small clearing. It looked just like the photos. Weathered wood, a wraparound porch, a stack of firewood neatly piled by the door. The place was old but solid. There was a well out back and a wood stove inside for heat. No electricity, no running water. Just a lantern, a few candles, and an old pump in the kitchen sink. I liked that. Felt like stepping back in time. The first day was fine, peaceful even. I unpacked, chopped some wood, and sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees. The silence was heavier than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I was used to the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of neighbors, the ever-present buzz of life. Out here, the only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of something moving in the underbrush. It was beautiful, but something about it put me on edge. That night, I lit a fire and made dinner, just a simple meal cooked over the wood stove. I read by lantern light for a while, then turned in early. The bed was stiff, the blankets smelled like old wood and dust, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was completely dark. For a moment, I lay there listening. The silence had changed. Before, it had been peaceful, but now it felt expectant, heavy, like something was waiting. I heard it then, a soft sound outside, a shuffle of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My stomach clenched. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound was gone. Just the wind, I told myself. The trees moving. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax. Then the doorknob rattled. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. I stared at the door, barely able to make out its shape in the dark. The knob moved again, a slow, testing twist. The door was locked. I had made sure of it, but someone was outside, standing there, trying to get in. I grabbed the lantern from the bedside table, my hands shaking as I fumbled to light it. The small flame cast flickering shadows across the walls. I forced myself to stand, to move toward the door. My throat was dry. "Hello!" My voice was barely more than a whisper. The knob went still. I waited. A long, terrible moment passed. Then, slow, heavy footsteps moving away from the porch, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the fire, lantern burning beside me, listening. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a bear, but I knew better. Someone had been there, watching me, testing the door. The first light, I went outside. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and there, clear as day, were footprints leading from the woods to my porch. They were human, barefoot. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at every window. I packed my things. I should have left then and there, but a part of me didn't want to admit how scared I was. Maybe it was some drifter passing through. Maybe they were just looking for shelter and moved on. I decided to stay, but I kept my hatchet close. The day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump. I barely ate. I kept checking the tree line, convinced I'd see someone standing there, just watching. But nothing happened. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself it was over. Then the noises started again. Not footsteps this time, scratching. Light, careful. Fingernails against wood. Came from the back of the cabin. I gripped the hatchet, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The scratching moved, creeping along the wall, toward the window. I forced myself to look. A face, just for a second. Pale skin, dark eyes, pressed against the glass. Then it was gone. I don't remember grabbing my bag. I don't remember throwing open the door. I just remember running, sprinting to my car, fumbling with the keys, peeling out so fast I nearly slammed into a tree. I drove all night. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station hours away, shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to call someone. The police found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Just an empty cabin in the woods. I never went back. Dave emailed me a week later, saying he was refunding my money. He didn't say why, but I think he knew. Some places aren't meant to be alone in. Some people aren't either. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain exactly what happened that weekend. Not in a way that makes sense, anyway. I've told myself over and over that it was just bad luck. Just one of those things where everything goes wrong at the same time. But there's a part of me that doesn't believe that. Not really. Some things just don't add up, no matter how hard I try to make them fit. It was late October when I drove up to the cabin. A last-minute trip, the kind of thing you do when you need to get out of your head for a while. I'd been feeling restless for weeks, like something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My friend Ben had mentioned the cabin a few times, said his family had owned it for decades but never used it anymore. It was deep in the woods, far from the city, no cell service, no internet. Perfect for clearing my mind, I thought. The drive was long and uneventful, the roads empty. As I got closer, the trees thickened, the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Old but sturdy, set back in a clearing, surrounded by nothing but trees. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, crisp with the first bite of winter creeping in. Felt peaceful, safe even. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a single bedroom, a living room with a stone fireplace. A few old pieces of furniture, some dust, but nothing too bad. There was a generator out back for power, a propane stove for cooking. No TV, no radio, no distractions. I settled in quickly, unpacked my bag, started a fire. The first night was quiet. I read for a while, made some tea, listened to the wind in the trees. When I went to bed, I slept better than I had in months. The second day was when things started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. I woke up late, later than I ever do, with this strange heaviness in my body. When I went outside, I found the woods were completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I told myself it was normal, that maybe I wasn't paying attention, but it stuck with me. That feeling like something was watching, just out of sight. By midday, I noticed more. My footprints from the day before were gone, completely erased like I had never walked there at all. I tried to shake it off, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, cooking, trying to keep busy. The wind picked up as the sun started setting, howling through the trees. I made sure the doors and windows were locked, checked the generator, then settled in for another night. That's when I heard it. A sound outside, something moving through the trees. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer and raccoons sound like. This was heavier, deliberate. Slow footsteps, circling the cabin. I turned off the lights, listened. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing happened. After an hour, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe the wind had played tricks on me. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The third day, I woke up to find the door to the cabin wide open. Not just unlocked, wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact I had locked it. I checked the ground outside, but there were no footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. But the door had been locked. I was sure of it. I spent the morning trying to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Maybe the wind had done it. But there was no way. I double-checked everything that night, locked the doors, moved a chair in front of the main entrance just in case. I even placed my boots near the door so I'd hear if someone stepped inside. I sat up late, listening. The wind had died down and the woods were still. Too still. No sound at all. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to the feeling that something was in the room with me. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I knew. That awful, gut-wrenching certainty that I wasn't alone. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing, but the air felt wrong. Too thick, too heavy. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I packed my things fast, threw everything into my bag, grabbed my keys, and bolted for the truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like something was standing just behind me, waiting. The truck started on the first try, and I tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, other people. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. I never told Ben what happened. Never told anyone, really. I don't know what was out there, what had been watching me, waiting. But I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't think I ever was. I don't know what made me rent that cabin in the first place. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the need for quiet after months of stress and noise. Or maybe it was something else, something I don't really want to think about. Either way, I found myself scrolling through listings of secluded cabins deep in the woods, far from people, far from roads, far from anything that reminded me of the life I had been drowning in. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story log cabin, tucked between thick trees with a small clearing in the front. The listing promised peace and escape. The pictures showed a cozy interior, warm lighting, wooden furniture that looked handcrafted, and a fireplace that seemed inviting. It was old, but well-kept. The kind of place that had character, that had been lived in. I booked it without hesitation. The drive there was uneventful. Long stretches of empty road, the kind that make you feel like you're driving through nowhere. When I finally turned off onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. The trees on either side of the path were dense, packed so tightly together that they seemed to close in the further I drove. The road itself was rough, full of dips and bumps, making me grip the wheel tighter than I needed to. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The place looked just like the pictures, better even. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a stone chimney stretched up the side. The windows were dark, empty, like unblinking eyes watching me. I shook the feeling off. I was just tired. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a small dinner, and sat by the fireplace with a book. The silence was almost overwhelming at first, but after a while, I started to appreciate it. No car horns, no distant hum of life, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden walls as they settled. It was peaceful. I slept well. It wasn't until the second night that things started feeling wrong. I had spent most of the day outside, hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air. By the time I got back, the sun was low, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it without really knowing why. The feeling had started then. A slow, creeping unease that curled around my ribs and settled deep in my stomach. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me and used to the isolation. But then I started noticing small things I couldn't ignore. First, the door. I had locked it. I was sure of that. But when I got up to grab some water, I saw it, slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough that a sliver of darkness stretched into the room. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there for what felt like minutes, just staring at it. Finally, I walked over and shut it, turning the lock again, making sure I heard the click. Then came the sounds. Not loud, nothing obvious, just small, almost imperceptible noises. A creak in the floorboards when I was sitting still. A soft rustling outside that made my skin prickle. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, the house settling, but I didn't really believe that. By the third night, I knew I wasn't alone. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. Movement. Not the wind. Not the house settling. Something deliberate. I stayed in bed, stiff, holding my breath, straining to hear. Footsteps. Not loud, not heavy. Careful. Testing the floor as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of a knife I had brought with me. When the first light filtered through the trees, I forced myself up and checked every inch of the cabin. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. But I knew what I had heard. I should have left then, packed my things and driven away. But I didn't. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that the isolation was getting to me. That's what I told myself over and over. The fourth night was worse. I had locked the doors, checked the windows, made sure everything was secure. I sat by the fireplace, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Then I heard it. Not inside this time, but outside. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving just beyond the tree line. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a single sound cut through the quiet. A knock. Soft, almost polite. Just once. Then nothing. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. My eyes stayed locked on the door, my mind racing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it again. Not at the door this time. At the window. I couldn't see anything outside. Just darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. I gripped the knife in my hand, every muscle in my body locked in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, knife in my lap, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. When morning came, I stepped outside, expecting to find footprints in the dirt. But there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I left that afternoon, threw my bags into the car and drove away without looking back. The whole way home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the road behind me. I never did. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, I will never go back to that cabin. And I will never again ignore that feeling in my gut that tells me when something isn't right. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I felt like I needed to get away. Maybe I just wanted some time alone. Either way, I found myself driving deeper into the woods, following a narrow dirt road that snaked between towering pines. The sun hung low in the sky, its light bleeding through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin was old but sturdy, tucked away in a clearing that felt entirely cut off from the rest of the world. A small, empty parking area sat just outside the tree line, and from there, a short path led to the front door. I parked my truck and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, clean and crisp in a way I didn't get back home. The cabin had been built decades ago, maybe even a century, with thick wooden beams and a slanted roof. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I fished the key from my pocket, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The inside smelled like dust and wood smoke, though there hadn't been a fire in the stone fireplace for a long time. It was exactly how I expected. Simple furniture, wooden floors, a small kitchen off to the side, and a single bedroom down a short hall. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just the quiet hum of nature pressing in from all sides. That was the point of all this, to disconnect. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting my bag down in the bedroom, and checking out the small pantry stocked with dry goods. Someone had left a few cans of soup, some rice, and instant coffee. I had brought my own supplies, so I wasn't worried. By the time I finished settling in, the sun had dipped below the trees. Darkness crept in fast out here. I lit the lanterns, their glow flickering against the walls, and sat on the couch with a book. The silence was heavier than I expected. No distant traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind shifting through the trees. It wasn't until I was ready to turn in that I noticed something that made my skin prickle. The front door. I was sure I had locked it after bringing in my things, but now it was unlocked. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to remember if I had gotten distracted. Maybe I had forgotten. I locked it again, double-checking this time, and headed to bed. That night, I slept lightly. Every noise seemed amplified in the silence. The creaking of the wood as it settled, the wind brushing against the windows, the rustling of something outside. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon. Morning came, and with it, the feeling that I had just been paranoid. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and listened to the birds. Everything felt normal again. That was until I walked around to the back of the cabin. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. They weren't mine. Someone had walked around the cabin, their prints pressing deep into the damp soil. My stomach twisted. I hadn't heard anyone. There were no other cars, no signs that anyone else was around. I followed the prints, my heartbeat hammering harder with each step. They led to the bedroom window. Someone had stood there, right outside where I had been sleeping, watching. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I scanned the trees, searching for movement, for any sign that someone was still there. Nothing, just the quiet rustling of the wind. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten turned around. Maybe they had seen the cabin and come closer out of curiosity. But why in the middle of the night? Why stand at the window? I shook off the thought, went back inside, and did a full sweep of the cabin. Nothing was out of place. The doors were still locked. It didn't make sense. I spent the day hiking, trying to push the uneasy feeling away. But by the time I returned, the sun had begun to set again, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I locked up early, checked all the windows, and sat with my back to the wall, facing the door. Every sound made my skin crawl. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice. Then they stopped. Silence. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, my hands clammy. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because I jolted awake to the sound of something tapping against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The bedroom window. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The tapping came again, slow, rhythmic. Not the wind, not a branch. Someone was outside. I forced myself to move, to inch toward the window, knife still clutched in my hand. The lantern's glow barely reached, casting shadows across the walls. I didn't look at first. I didn't want to, but I had to. I turned my head. The window was empty, but the footprints were back. And this time, they led to the front door. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and rushed for the door. I flung it open, stepping onto the porch, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I ran to my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone. But I didn't stick around to find out. I drove away, heart hammering, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The cabin disappeared into the night, swallowed by the trees. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. and I don't ever want to find out. I never wanted to stay in that cabin. It was too far from town, too quiet, and too isolated. But I had no other choice. My brother, Aaron, had bought the place a few years ago with some fantasy of turning it into a hunting retreat, but life got in the way. Work, family, responsibilities, he never had the time to fix it up. So when he called me and asked if I could stay there for a while, keep an eye on the place while he figured out whether to sell or not, I felt like I had to say yes. I arrived in late October. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, just barely passable with my truck. Trees crowded both sides, their bare branches reaching over the dirt path like skeletal fingers. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of damp leaves and wood. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something about that place made my stomach twist. The cabin itself was small, built from dark, weathered logs. The windows were clouded with grime, and the front porch sagged slightly, its wood soft in places from years of neglect. The place had an old smell, something between dust and damp wood, with a faint hint of mildew. I dropped my bags inside, made sure the generator worked, and then took a look around. The kitchen was basic, just a propane stove and an old fridge that hummed louder than it should. The bedroom had a twin bed with a thin mattress, and the bathroom was small but functional. There was no TV, no internet, and my phone barely had a signal. I figured I'd read, do some writing, maybe get some hiking in before winter hit. I wasn't thrilled about being alone, but it was just for a few weeks. I'd be fine. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time chopping wood, hiking, and trying to get used to the silence. But at night, that silence felt oppressive. I'd wake up several times, unsure of what had disturbed me. Sometimes I thought I heard something outside, a faint rustling or the creak of the porch, but when I checked, nothing was there. Then I found the first set of footprints. It had rained the night before, a light drizzle that turned the dirt around the cabin to mud. I stepped outside that morning, my breath hanging in the air, and I saw them. Footprints leading up to the porch steps. Bare footprints. Human. I stood there, my skin crawling. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the trees standing still, their skeletal branches swaying slightly in the wind. I checked the door. It was still locked. The windows were shut. I told myself it was probably a hiker, someone who got lost and wandered up here. Maybe they left when they saw no one was home. But there were no footprints leading away from the cabin, only toward it. That night, I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and kept my rifle close. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the cabin walls made my nerves tighten. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to a sound outside. A slow, deliberate creak of the porch boards. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. Another creak, then silence. I reached for my rifle, moving as quietly as I could. My fingers trembled as I flicked the safety off. I wanted to turn on the light, but something in me resisted. If someone was out there, I didn't want them knowing exactly where I was. I sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. No more sounds came. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was leaking through the window. I checked the porch as soon as I stepped outside. The footprints were back, fresh in the damp wood. Bare feet, the same ones as before, but this time they didn't stop at the steps. They circled the cabin, around and around. I swallowed hard, my hands clammy despite the cold. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I slept, watching, waiting. I scanned the tree line, but it was empty. I felt exposed standing there out in the open. I went back inside and locked the door. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in me screamed to pack up and go. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some weirdo messing around, trying to scare me. If I left now, I'd feel stupid when I got back to town and had to explain why I ran off like a coward. That night, I kept every light off and stayed by the window, watching. Hours passed. The wind howled, branches scraped against the cabin. I nearly convinced myself it was all in my head. Then, just past 3 in the morning, I saw movement. A figure just at the edge of the trees. Too far to see clearly, but I knew it was a person. They stood there, still as stone, just watching the cabin. My pulse pounded in my ears. I gripped the rifle tighter. I wanted to shout, to warn them off, but my throat felt dry, locked up with fear. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, they turned and walked back into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care if I looked stupid. I was done. I loaded everything into the truck, started the engine, and pulled onto the dirt road. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. I got a motel for the night, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trying to slow my breathing. I felt safe, but a part of me knew that feeling was temporary. I called Aaron the next morning, told him I wasn't staying at the cabin anymore, told him everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't call me paranoid. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "Yeah, I think I'll just sell the place." He never explained why. I took the cabin for a weekend to get some quiet. Life had been getting too loud. Work, city traffic, endless notifications on my phone. I needed somewhere to clear my head. A friend of mine, Kyle, had mentioned this place up in the woods a few hours from town. He'd stayed there once and swore it was the perfect spot for solitude. No Wi-Fi, no service, barely any signs of life. Sounded perfect. I got there late Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, the last stretch being nothing but a dirt road winding through the thick forest. My car kicked up dust, the trees closing in on either side. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked when I stepped on it. There was no driveway, just a patch of flattened grass where past visitors had parked. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a couch, and a small kitchen. A separate bedroom off to the side, and a bathroom that looked like it had last been updated in the 80s. It smelled of wood and old fabric. The air was still, thick with the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, read a book, and went to bed early. The bed was stiff, the kind that makes your back ache in the morning, but I was too tired to care. I left the window open a crack, letting in the cool night air. The forest outside was alive, branches shifting, the occasional rustling of an animal moving in the brush. Normal sounds. Sometime past midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark except for a thin sliver of moonlight through the curtains. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Outside, just past the window. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Not the scattered movements of a deer or raccoon. Something heavier. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, crunching leaves, then stopping. Right outside the bedroom wall. Then silence. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, heart pounding. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe the house settling. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. Saturday morning, I went outside to check. The ground was soft from recent rain, holding tracks well. I walked around to where I thought I'd heard the steps. There, in the dirt, were footprints. Large, boot prints. Not mine. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker? But there were no trails out here, no campsites nearby. Just this cabin. And whoever it was had walked right up to the window and stopped. I felt watched. The air was too still. The trees seemed closer. I shook the feeling off, went back inside, locked the door. The rest of the day, I tried to relax, but my mind kept circling back to the footprints. I kept checking the window, expecting to see someone standing out there. I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. I thought I heard sounds outside again, but nothing as clear as the night before. Just the occasional creak, the wind shifting through the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I locked the bedroom door before going to sleep. Sunday morning, I packed early. I didn't want to stay another night. As I loaded my bag into the car, I glanced back at the cabin, at the windows. Then I saw it. Something in the dirt, just outside the bedroom wall. I walked closer, my stomach twisting. More footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line, stopping at the window, right where I had been sleeping. But this time there was something else. A single long scratch on the wood, just below the window, like someone had dragged a knife across it. I got in my car and left, checking the rearview mirror the whole way down that dirt road. I never went back. I never told Kyle what happened. I just knew I wasn't alone that weekend, and that whoever had been out there watching was waiting for something. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night, and I don't want to. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The long drive up the mountain had been rough. The dirt road was uneven, full of deep ruts and loose gravel, winding through thick trees that swallowed up the last light of day. My truck's tires crunched against the rock, the only sound in the heavy quiet of the woods. The place belonged to my uncle, though he hadn't been up here in years. He let me use it whenever I needed a break from the city. No cell service, no internet, just an old generator for power and a wood stove for heat. That's exactly what I wanted. I needed time away from people, from noise, from everything. The cabin was small, a single story with a steep, slanted roof and faded wood siding. It had a covered porch with an old rocking chair that creaked even when no one was sitting in it. The windows were small and dark, and the front door stuck slightly when I tried to open it. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was basic: a small couch, a wooden table, a single bed pushed into the corner. The walls were lined with shelves filled with canned goods and supplies, all of it left over from when my uncle used to spend whole summers up here. The generator sat in the back room, a gas-powered beast that roared to life after a few hard pulls on the cord. The light bulbs flickered once before settling into a dim, yellow glow. I unpacked my things quickly, just a duffel bag with some clothes, a hunting knife, a flashlight, and a few books. I had food in a cooler, enough for a few days. The air was cold, so I started a fire in the wood stove, listening to the dry logs crackle and pop. The silence out here was different from the city. It wasn't empty. It was full of sounds that didn't belong to people. The wind moving through the trees, the creaking of branches, the rustling of something small moving through the underbrush, the occasional distant call of an animal. I stood on the porch for a while, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The sky turned dark fast, and without city lights, it was pure black. The stars were sharp and bright, scattered across the sky like broken glass. I took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. That was when I first noticed something. The woods were too quiet. I didn't realize it at first, but something had changed. The wind had stopped. The rustling, the distant animal calls, gone. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Heavy, unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I turned back inside and locked the door. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was adjusting to the isolation. I sat down at the table, ate a sandwich from my cooler, and read by the dim light of the cabin's old bulbs. A sound, soft, close. I froze, listening, came from outside, near the trees. A slow, deliberate crunching. Footsteps. I set my book down carefully, my pulse quickening. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but the sound wasn't random. It wasn't the skittering of small feet or the shuffle of an animal nosing through leaves. It was heavy, slow. Someone was walking outside the cabin. I stood up quietly, moving to the window. The glass reflected the dim light from inside, making it hard to see out. I killed the light with a quick flick of the switch. Now I could see. The porch was empty. The yard was empty, but just beyond the tree line, where the darkness swallowed the shapes of the branches, something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shape standing still, watching. I reached for my hunting knife, gripping the handle tightly. My uncle kept an old shotgun here, but it was in the storage closet, and I wasn't about to make any sudden moves. I stayed by the window, heart pounding. Then, after what felt like forever, the figure moved. Not toward the cabin, not away from it, just to the side. It slipped into the trees, blending with the dark. The crunching sound faded, swallowed by the forest. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure the shotgun was loaded. Then I sat on the couch, knife in my lap, listening. I didn't sleep much. By morning, the forest was back to normal. Birds chirped. The wind moved through the trees again. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making everything seem normal. I told myself it had been a trick of the light. Maybe I was just jumpy from being alone. I stayed near the cabin all day, chopping firewood, making sure the generator had enough gas. That night, it happened again. The silence, the slow, deliberate footsteps outside. I turned off the light and waited by the window. The figure was closer this time, just standing at the edge of the yard. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a tree. It was a person. I gripped the shotgun, my hands clammy. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight. Something about this wasn't right. Then, like before, the figure moved, slipping back into the trees. Gone. I didn't wait for a third night. At first light, I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove back down the mountain. I didn't stop until I hit paved roads. Didn't let myself breathe easy until I was back in the city. I never told my uncle, never told anyone. A few months later, I heard that a hiker had gone missing near that area. Search teams found his camp, but not him. The only thing left behind was his gear and a trail of footprints leading into the woods. They never found him. I haven't been back to the cabin since. The cabin was a last-minute idea, something I thought would help clear my head. Work had been pushing me hard, and I was tired of the city. I wanted something simple, just a few days away from people, from noise, from everything. I found a place online, cheap, a little rundown, but the pictures looked decent. The owner was some old guy who barely used email, so everything was set up over the phone. Cash payment, no questions asked. The drive took longer than expected. The last 30 miles were nothing but dirt roads, winding through thick trees that stretched for miles. The GPS signal was gone an hour before I even reached the turnoff. The only sign that I was in the right place was a rusted mailbox with faded numbers. I pulled into the long driveway, the trees pressing in on both sides. The cabin itself was small and squat, made of dark logs with a sagging roof. The front porch looked like it might give out if I stepped too hard. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something stale. I had expected quiet, but this was different. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing as I stepped out of the car. The key was under a loose brick, just like the old man said. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty living room. A sagging couch sat against one wall, facing a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was small, just a fridge and a two-burner stove. The bedroom had a thin mattress on an old wooden frame. Everything felt abandoned, forgotten. I told myself it was fine. It was just for a few days. The first night, I built a fire. The heat was nice, but it made the walls creak. I told myself it was just the wood settling, but it didn't stop. Long after I put the fire out, I kept hearing it, groaning, shifting, like something moving in the walls. I barely slept. The second day, I walked. I brought my boots, figuring I could hike a little, clear my head. The trees were dense, the kind that blocked out the sky. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even though it was midday. I found an old hunting stand, rotting and half-buried in the undergrowth. Nearby, there were bones. I told myself they were animal bones, but they were scattered, broken in a way that made my stomach turn. I left. That night, the noises got worse. Not just the wood creaking, something else. Scratching. Not from a mouse, something bigger. I lay in bed, listening, trying to convince myself it was just in my head. Then I heard something drag across the floor. Slow, heavy. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my flashlight, shining it toward the living room. Nothing, just an empty room, the fire burned down to embers. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up, listening, waiting for something to happen. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I told myself I was overreacting. The cabin was old, probably had raccoons or something living in the walls. I was just being paranoid. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read a little, ate some of the food I brought. Every now and then, I swore I heard something moving outside. Not an animal, something slow, careful. I stepped out once, but the woods were empty. Too empty. I wanted to leave, but the thought of driving those roads at night made my stomach twist. I told myself one more night, just one. The last night was worse. I kept a fire going, hoping the light would help. Didn't. The noises started again, the scratching, the dragging. At one point, I heard something scrape against the window. My hands clenched around the blanket. I didn't look. Then the smell hit me. Rotten, sour, like meat left in the sun. It filled the cabin, thick and choking. My throat tightened, and I had to swallow the urge to gag. My mind raced, trying to find a reason. Dead animal under the porch? Something in the chimney? Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside. I froze. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I turned my head slowly. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The smell was stronger now, filling my nose, my mouth. Something moved behind me. I didn't think. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the key. I yanked the door open and ran. The woods swallowed me. I didn't think about where I was going, just away. Branches whipped at my face. Roots snagged my feet. The smell followed me, like it was clinging to my clothes, my skin. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the car. My hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into reverse, peeling out so fast the tires kicked up gravel. I didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, the dragging noise, the smell. When I got back to the city, I told myself it was just my imagination. The cabin was old, animals in the walls, rotting wood. I wanted to believe it, but last night, as I was lying in bed, I smelled it again. I don't know how to explain what happened at the cabin. I've thought about it 1,000 times, and I still can't make sense of it. But I know it happened. I know I didn't imagine it. And I know that whatever was out there, it was real. It started with a trip I didn't even want to take. My older brother, Luke, had convinced me to go out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere for a week. He said it would be good for me, get away from work, clear my head. I wasn't excited about it, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He knew a guy from work who owned the place, said we could use it for free. Figured, why not? A week away from the noise of the city didn't sound that bad. I packed a bag, grabbed some groceries, and drove up there by myself since Luke had to work late and would be coming up the next day. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road wasn't even paved, just dirt and gravel cutting through thick woods. My phone lost service about 15 minutes before I got to the cabin, which didn't sit right with me, but I told myself it was fine. I wasn't planning on using my phone much anyway. The cabin itself was old but solid. A single-story structure with a porch that wrapped around the front. It had that musty smell old wood gets when it sits too long in the damp air. Inside, there was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. The bathroom was tiny, barely enough room to turn around in. It was simple, but it was comfortable enough. By the time I got settled in, the sun was starting to set. The trees outside cast long shadows across the yard. I stood on the porch, looking out at the woods, and for a second, I had this weird feeling in my gut, like I was being watched. But when I looked around, there was nothing, just trees and silence. I shook it off and went inside to make some dinner. The first night was uneventful, at least at first. I ate, read for a while, and went to bed early, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not heavy, but not light either. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just silence. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was half asleep and dreaming, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and there were footprints. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare footprints. Human. They led from the edge of the woods to the porch, circled around the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there last night, watching, walking around. I told myself it was just some local messing around, but the whole day I couldn't shake the unease. The woods felt different, too quiet. The birds barely made a sound. The wind barely moved the leaves. I tried to brush it off. Luke would be here soon, and it would all seem silly in the daylight. That night, it happened again. The footsteps. This time, I was ready. I had my flashlight and a kitchen knife from the drawer. I waited, heart pounding, as the steps circled the cabin. Then they stopped, right outside the front door. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Then, after what felt like forever, a soft knock. Not hard, just 3 quiet taps. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to yell, to do anything, but I just sat there, frozen. The knocking didn't come again. After a few minutes, I heard the footsteps moving away, back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. Morning came and Luke still hadn't shown up. I checked my phone. No service. I considered leaving, but my car was low on gas, and the nearest station was almost an hour away. I told myself I'd wait until noon, then drive into town if Luke still hadn't arrived. I spent the morning on edge, jumping at every sound. At some point, I forced myself to eat, even though my stomach felt sick. Noon came and went. No sign of Luke. I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and got in the car. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic set in. I popped the hood, though I had no idea what I was looking for. Everything seemed fine. I got back in, turned the key again. This time, the engine turned over, but it sounded wrong, like it was struggling. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I had no choice. I backed out of the driveway and started down the dirt road. I didn't get far, maybe a mile from the cabin. The car shuddered and died. I tried to start it again. Nothing. I was stuck. No service. No way to call for help. My only option was to walk. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and started toward town. The walk was quiet at first, just the crunch of gravel under my feet. The trees felt closer than before, like they were pressing in. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me, soft footsteps, just out of sync with mine. I kept looking back, but I didn't see anything. Then, about halfway down the road, I saw something ahead, a figure, standing just off the road, half hidden behind a tree. My heart pounded. I stopped. It didn't move. I couldn't see its face, just a dark outline. I turned my flashlight on, but as soon as the beam hit the spot, the figure was gone. Just trees. No sign of anyone. I ran. I don't remember much of the next few minutes, just running, the sound of my own breath, the pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I saw a gas station ahead, lights glowing in the dusk. I burst through the door, out of breath, wild-eyed. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy. I told him my car had broken down. I left out the rest. He let me use the phone to call Luke. When he answered, I almost cried. He was pissed, said he'd been trying to call me all day, said he got held up at work but was already on the way. I told him where I was and he came to get me. I never went back to the cabin. Luke did the next day with a tow truck. He said everything looked normal. My car had some sort of electrical issue. He didn't see any footprints, didn't hear anything weird, He laughed it off, said I was just freaked out from being alone in the woods. Maybe he's right. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that someone or something was out there, watching. I was alone in the cabin. That was the plan, at least. I needed the space. I needed the quiet. Life had been too loud for too long, and I had reached the point where I felt like my own thoughts were slipping away from me. So I took time off, found a rental deep in the woods, and told no one exactly where I was going. Just a general direction in case something happened. The drive was uneventful, long stretches of road leading into narrower dirt paths. The trees thickened, and the world outside the windshield became nothing but tall pines and winding trails. I lost cell service a little after turning off the main road, but I had expected that. I had downloaded maps ahead of time, and the directions led me exactly where I needed to go. The cabin was small, just as I wanted. A single-story structure with a loft, made of dark wood, nestled in the trees. It looked old but sturdy. A wraparound porch with a single rocking chair sat at the front. The owner had left the key under a loose stone near the door, as promised. Inside, it smelled of dust and pine. The air was thick, unmoving. The furniture was simple, wooden chairs, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, a small kitchen with an old gas stove. There was a single bedroom, but I chose the loft for sleeping. It had a window that overlooked the trees, and I liked the idea of waking up to that view. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking the food I had brought, checking the water, making sure the generator worked. It did, though it sputtered a little when I first turned it on. Night fell quickly, the darkness outside pressing against the cabin windows. I had expected quiet, but the woods were never silent. The wind shifted through the trees, making them creak. Small animals rustled through the underbrush. Once, in the middle of the night, I heard something larger moving just beyond the tree line. A deer, probably, or a bear. I forced myself to ignore it and eventually fell asleep. The second day, I explored. There were trails behind the cabin, leading deeper into the forest. The trees were dense, the light barely cutting through in some places. I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed, and a stream that ran cold and fast. The air was fresh, crisp in a way I hadn't felt in years. I felt good, lighter. That feeling didn't last. It started with small things, little noises in the cabin when there shouldn't have been. A soft scrape, like something shifting across the floor. A thump from the other side of the wall when I was sure I was alone. The kind of sounds you could ignore if you tried hard enough, if you told yourself it was just the wood settling, the wind, the house breathing. Then I noticed other things. My bag wasn't where I left it, just a foot to the side, barely noticeable, but enough to make me stop. The pantry door, which I always closed, was open one morning. Not wide, just cracked, but I knew I had shut it. The third night, I woke up suddenly. No sound had startled me, just a feeling, like something had changed in the air. I stayed still, listening. The wind had died down. The usual rustling of animals had stopped. The forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate on the porch outside. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs. My breath stuck in my throat. The steps didn't stop. They moved from one side of the porch to the other, slow and careful. Not an animal. An animal would sniff, scratch, move with uncertainty. This was different. It was measured. I sat up, reaching for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. I hesitated before turning it on. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. No sound, no movement. The air was thick, pressing down on me. Finally, I reached for my phone, knowing full well I had no service. I checked anyway. No bars, no Wi-Fi, just me and the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I forced myself to step outside. The porch was empty. No footprints, though the wood was too hard-packed to hold any. I circled the cabin, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Cabin noises, the wind playing tricks on me, my own nerves. I had come out here to get away, to reset my mind. I wasn't going to let a few strange sounds drive me back. The fourth night, I locked the door. I wedged a chair under the handle just in case. I slept with my flashlight in my hand, my hunting knife within reach. At some point in the night, I woke up again. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I noticed the light. A beam of light, thin and sharp, moving across the wall, like someone walking outside with a flashlight. The movement was slow, steady, scanning the walls. I held my breath, heart pounding. It wasn't my light. It wasn't the moon. It was coming from outside. I listened, straining to hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. Then, faintly, the sound of something brushing against the wall. Fingertips, a stick? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I stayed as still as possible. The light moved again, cutting across the window, pausing there. Whoever was outside knew I was inside. They were looking for a reaction. I didn't give them one. After what felt like hours, the light disappeared. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. When the sun came up, I packed my things. Fast. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't try to convince myself to stay. I locked up, tossed the key where I found it, and drove away without looking back. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? There was no proof, no pictures, no footprints, nothing stolen. Just a feeling, the undeniable knowledge that I was not alone. A week later, I checked the listing. The cabin was still available. The owner had left a new note in the description. Do not leave food outside. Lock the doors at night. No refunds for early departures. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the stress of work. Maybe it was the guilt of canceling plans too many times before. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't the kind of person who let irrational fear get in the way of things. But the moment I saw that cabin, I knew I had made a mistake. It stood at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place where the trees pressed in too close, where the wind didn't move the branches in a natural way. The logs of the cabin were dark, weathered, and warped with age, and the windows were so dirty that the glass barely reflected the fading light of the evening. I had expected something rustic, sure. That was the whole point of renting the place. But this looked abandoned. The road leading up to the property was barely a road at all. Just two ruts carved through the dirt, leading up a steep incline that my truck had struggled to climb. No signs, no markers, just a pin dropped on a map that brought me here. I had rented the place for a long weekend, just 3 nights. The idea was simple: unplug from everything. No work emails, no notifications, no distractions. I hadn't even brought my laptop. Just a few books, some food, and enough firewood to last the weekend. The key was under the mat, just like the listing had said. It was an old brass thing, heavy in my palm, the edges worn smooth from years of use. The lock resisted when I turned it, the door groaning like something waking up from a deep sleep. The smell inside hit me first. A mix of old wood, damp air, and something else, something stale. The furniture was old, mismatched, and covered in a thin layer of dust. A single couch sat against the wall, its fabric worn and sagging. A wood-burning stove crouched in the corner, rusted but functional. The kitchen was little more than a counter with a sink and an old gas stove. I checked my phone. No service. That was expected. But seeing the little no-signal message still made my stomach tighten. I turned on the single overhead light, and the bulb flickered weakly before settling into a dim, yellow glow. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that my mind was filling in gaps with nonsense. It was an old cabin. That was the point. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I dropped my bag on the floor and went to check the bedroom. There was only one, and it wasn't much more than a bed with a sagging mattress, a single dresser, and a window that looked out into the trees. The sun was almost down now, and the trees had taken on that deep, endless blackness that comes just before true night. I shut the door. I made myself dinner, canned chili heated on the stove, eaten straight out of the pot. I kept the overhead light on, even though it buzzed faintly, and I double-checked the locks before I sat down to eat. I told myself it was just habit. The first night was uneventful, but my sleep was restless. The bed was uncomfortable, the silence too heavy. It was the kind of silence that pressed against my ears, making me aware of my own breathing. At some point in the night, I woke up. No reason, just awake. Took me a second to realize what was wrong. The overhead light in the main room was on. I knew I had turned it off before bed. I sat up slowly, listening. The cabin was quiet. I could hear the wind outside, the faint creak of the old wood settling. I got up, my heartbeat loud in my ears, and stepped out of the bedroom. The light was on. Nothing else was out of place. The door was still locked. The windows were closed. I told myself I must have forgotten, that I had left it on without realizing it. But I knew I hadn't. I turned it off and went back to bed. The second day passed quietly. I hiked a little, read a book, made another simple meal. But the unease from the night before never really left me. Every noise made me look up. Every shadow felt too deep. I started noticing small things. Scratches in the wood near the door frame, as if something had clawed at it. The way the trees outside seemed too still, even when the wind moved through them. That night, I double-checked the locks. I made sure the light was off. I told myself I was being ridiculous. And then, in the middle of the night, I woke up again. Not because of a sound, not because of a dream, just awake. The light was on again. My throat went dry. My hands clenched into fists. I stayed in bed for a long time, staring at the glow leaking under the door. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to roll over and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. I got up, heart pounding, and stepped into the main room. The light was on, and the front door was unlocked. I stopped, stared. I knew I had locked it. I walked over, slow, every muscle in my body tight, and pressed my palm against the wood. It was cold. Something was wrong. I locked the door again. This time, I pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't sleep after that. The last day was a blur. I wanted to leave, but I forced myself to stay. I didn't want to be the kind of person who let fear win. But I didn't feel alone anymore. That night, I didn't turn off the light. I sat on the couch, eyes on the door, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the outside of the door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound stopped. And then, from the other side of the door, the knob turned. Once, twice, testing. I grabbed my keys, my bag, my shoes. I didn't look out the window. I didn't stop to think. I threw the couch back, yanked the door open, and ran. The forest was black, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. My truck was up the road, too far, but I ran anyway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. When I reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so hard I almost dropped them. The door groaned as I yanked it open, and I threw myself inside, locking it behind me. My headlights cut through the dark as I turned the engine over, illuminating the trees, the road. The cabin stood there, still and silent. The door was open. I never rented a cabin again.